Muchas gracias, Camila, Monse, Gabriela. I don't have prepared remarks for today. I thought I would listen and respond and then take some questions from you. But perhaps I might just start by going back to this question that President Henning Jensen cited for you, whose lives are grievable. And I understand there's no Spanish word for grievable, but let us translate it as who are treated as if their lives are worthy of being grieved. When you ask the question, when I ask the question, whose life is worthy of grief, worthy of being grieved, I'm asking a question not just about those who have died, but those who are living. What does it mean to live as a grievable life? Well, if you are a grievable life, that means it would matter if you were gone. It would matter if you were missing. It would matter if you were injured, and it would matter if you were killed. It means that the broader world would take notice of what has happened to you, or would grieve your loss if something were to happen to you. But it also has a kind of positive meaning. If you are a life that is worth grieving, that means that people, practices, institutions would be oriented toward the safeguarding of your life. They would want your life to continue. They would want to support your life. Those institutions, practices, relationships would implicitly conceptualize an open future for you, in which you could live your life out according to its own time, realizing your wishes and goals. So, if you live in a world where your future is imagined by the institutions in which you live, I hope that's translatable, where implicit to the institutions in which you live is the commitment to your continuing life, then you are grievable. In other words, those institutions will do what they can to stop the shortening of your life and to promote a full life, or a life that can be lived as fully and as long as you wish. So when I say that there are grievable and ungrievable populations, I, of course, overstate the case. It's not as if we can draw a circle around the grievable population and draw another circle around the ungrievable population. It's rather that I'm asking for us to consider that some lives are protected, secured, and supported, and others are abandoned, and that there is a differential way of considering the value of lives. In other words, there is an inegalitarian distribution of the value of lives. We don't think about the value of life as something that is distributed. We think about goods as distributed. We think about benefits as distributed. But perhaps also the value of life is distributed unequally, which doesn't mean that there's a single sovereign power who decides, let's distribute the value of life this way and not this way. I think there are more diffuse power mechanisms, we might call them post-sovereign mechanisms of power, that in effect produce populations whose value and privilege is safeguarded, and populations who are abandoned or who are considered to be ungrievable, which means they can be lost, they can be abandoned, they can even be killed without there being a sense that someone or some group of people who are valuable have been lost. Now, in fact, I don't think the world is as binary as I just described it. I don't think that there's one population here and one population here. I think there is a continuum. I think there are some discontinuities within that continuum. In certain contexts, people may well be grievable, and in other contexts, not at all. You may be very grievable within your family, but completely ungrievable at work, or you might be grievable at work and ungrievable in your family. Those are just examples. What I want to underscore here is that when we think about these overwhelming statistics of violence that we heard today from Monza and Gabriella both, how do we understand how it can be that so many people are killed, how many women are killed, without there being prosecution, without there being collective outrage, without there being a demand to change social, economic, and political life so that such killings no longer happen? And I want to suggest to you that when a population is deeply devalued, that is to say, when they are considered to be dispensable lives, lives that can be lost without there being a loss of value, that is because those lives have already been nullified as lives. In other words, if no one is there, if that person who is killed is not a person, is no one, if that group that is killed is not understood to be a set of living beings worthy of life, then indeed, when they are killed, nothing has happened. There is no loss. They have already been nullified. So if you kill what has already been nullified, you do nothing. That is a redundancy. They are already lost. They are already nothing. How can you mourn a nothing? How can you mourn a no one? I think this is one reason why today we see that very often acts of public mourning that involve many people showing up, writing, performing, singing, dancing, protesting, in acts of commemoration, are also understood to be acts of protest. In fact, time and again, we see that the group that gathers to commemorate those who have been killed is also the group that is protesting the conditions of the killing. So it matters, for instance, in Ayotzinapa, for the Ayotzinapa students, that they were gathering to protest the austerity measures. But they were also gathering to get ready to go to Mexico City to commemorate the students who had been killed in those demonstrations 2 years before. So what were they doing? Were they mourning? Were they protesting? To mourn together, to mourn publicly, is to avow that these are lives worth grieving, that they did matter, that these were bodies that matter. And bodies that matter have to be marked, recognized, and commemorated when they are lost. And bodies that matter have to be supported, recognized, and included when they are living. I think at the beginning of my work, I was concerned with the fact that so many gay men were dying around me in the 1980s, and I did not understand why those lives who died from AIDS were not memorialized, why there was shame, why the fact that they were sick was hidden, the fact that they died was sometimes covered over. And I was alarmed. Why can't we affirm the fact that they engaged in sexual pleasure, that they died through a sexually transmitted disease for which there was no cure, and that this was a terrible loss. Those who were closest to them, those who loved them most dearly, were not able openly to express their loss. It was as if the love and the loss could not be acknowledged. It was as if this censorship or prohibition on acknowledging the love and acknowledging the loss produced a kind of secret world or a world of shame in which love could not be named and loss could not be mourned. It worried me that certain kinds of love, certain populations were suffering so deeply and could not avow their losses, their suffering, and that healthcare and research was not being oriented toward the immediate problems of finding a solution for AIDS and caring for those who were ill. Of course, all this still happens in various parts of the world. It's not as if this story is over. It happened to me in the 1980s, but it's happening still in many parts of the world, as you no doubt know. But what shocked me, or maybe what changed my focus a little, was after September 11th, when the US was attacked, and immediately those who died in those absolutely horrific attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, those who died were openly mourned. They were extravagantly mourned. We knew their names, we knew their families, we knew the name of their dogs. We identified with them on a national basis, and a very deep sense of national sympathy emerged. Right? We knew them, they were like us, we could mourn them. But the minute the US went to war and started killing populations in Iraq, for instance, did we know any of those names? No, we knew none of those names. Could we pronounce those names? No, we couldn't pronounce those names. Those names were unpronounceable. Right? That was some other language, some language we would never learn, we would never know. Were those lives also grievable for us who were so openly grieving? No, you don't grieve those lives, even though those lives were in no sense responsible for the attacks on the United States. Oh, well, that's just a detail. It was not only an astonishing time then, but it remains an astonishing time. Why is it that we grieve so deeply for those we recognize as like us, and we fail to extend our grief, meaning extend our acknowledgement, our recognition of the value of other lives to those who speak another language, who live in another part of the world, with whom we share no sense of national or linguistic commonality? Why can't we learn to distribute the equality of the value of life across global differences, across languages, across regions? It would mean that we would have to learn how to translate. I believe cultural translation is one of the most important practices we can engage in. not to assimilate ourselves to another language and not to demand that another language assimilate itself to ours, but to confront the encounter, the difficulty, the necessity of learning to value bodies that matter across linguistic divide, across cultural divides, across geopolitical divides. So when I think about our discussion here today, I also want to think a little bit more carefully about how this mechanism works, whereby some lives are considered grievable and others not. And I want to suggest to you that there are various ways of doing violence. When we think about violence, we very often think about the physical encounter, or an encounter with a weapon, a body and a weapon. And of course, that is very often the way violence works. We think about domestic violence, we think about violence against women, we think about street violence. All of these usually involve one body against another, or one body with a weapon against another. But of course, sometimes violence becomes more ambiguous when we don't know, for instance, who has killed the protester, who has killed the gay activist in Honduras, who has killed the Ayotzinapa students. Is it the police? Is it the militarized police? Is it a security firm that has been hired by a business interest, a cartel? Is it state-sponsored? Is it vigilante? How do we know, and how do we think about these complex interrelationships? Of course, there is also, I believe, institutional violence. And we find that, for instance, in policies that govern the distribution of water and the distribution of food and the distribution of shelter. Because without water and without food and without shelter, populations are exposed to disease, to death, to insecurity, and to violence. Now you could say those policies are not doing violence in the way that a person on the street does violence in a physical encounter. That's right. But the institution that prepares the condition for the abandonment of a life is surely involved in its own kind of violence. Can we distinguish among modalities of violence? Perhaps violence also works through language. Perhaps at those moments when we proclaim that certain lives are not valuable, we are also participating in an act of violence, or we are complicitous with an act of violence. So acts of racism against the indigenous. Speech acts that also enter into practices that become reflected in institutions and sometimes become explicit state policy and sometimes not. In other words, what prepares the ground for violence? Is that not complicitous with violence? And what permits violence without actually doing it? Sometimes a state is not responsible for the violence that happens within its borders, but it does nothing to stop it. And when we have the situation of so many women being killed and there being no prosecution of the men who killed them, what does it mean that the legal system refuses to acknowledge that that killing is a crime, to treat it as a crime, and to prosecute it as a crime? Then the legal system sends a message: this killing is permissible. So even though we could say, but the legal system does not kill, we can see that it operates within a particular organization of power that lets it be known that killing will not be prosecuted. Killing is not a crime. That's what people do. Okay, I think I've spoken long enough. There are many more topics, but I guess I wanted simply to say one last thing, which is that we also have to remember that killing is a message from those who kill, that if you do what the killed person did, if you speak out on the street, even if you're 13, if you gather together to mourn the loss of those who were killed brutally by police forces, if you become an activist in a certain area, you too will suffer that fate. So the killing is a spectacle that also acts to terrorize those who see the spectacle. Right? This could happen to me, this could happen to my child, this could happen any time. I must be careful, I must follow the laws, I must keep my head down, I must not protest. And it is through that terrorization that we all decide, when we decide, oh, I will say nothing, I will do nothing, I will not publicly mourn those losses, I will not show that I am appalled by those losses, that I don't want to live in a world in which those kinds of losses are accepted and reproduced at the rate that they are. In other words, that process by which the spectacle of killing terrorizes us into silence and complicity is part of the larger cycle of violence. So don't be terrorized. It's not so, it's easier for me to say, isn't it? One must struggle against allowing oneself to be completely terrorized. It seems to me we can acknowledge that this is fearful, that this is frightening, but it's only through arriving together in expanding circles of solidarity that any of us stand a chance of making clear how important it is to understand that all these bodies do matter. Thank you.